Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lent. Hard to believe it's that time already, isn't it? Well, and especially because we feel like we've been going through a really long Lent starting a year ago when we were in quarantine. But it seems there's hope on the horizon. We are seeing people get vaccinated, the cases are coming down. Um, there is just this sense that the night is lifting, not gone, but lifting. And that is the purpose of Lent, is that liminal time between the darkness and the hope. And so I'm inviting you to join with some reflections over the next 5 weeks. The first thing I want to mention is that we sent out in your bags or your mailings this devotional, The Road Back to God. And we invite you to be looking at that. There's some really good reflections on what it means to find Jesus in your life. So that is one resource. The other thing is, I will be talking about, over the next few weeks, I will be sharing this notion of our story and Jesus' story. That is two important stories, your story or the world's story, as it lines up with Jesus' story. Sometimes we don't gather the two together. Sometimes we listen to Jesus' story and say, that's a nice story, but what does it have to do with my story? Or conversely, we say, this is my story. I'm not sure Jesus has anything to do with me. So I want to start out with the text, and I will be reminding us of this text throughout our devotions. It's one of my favorite ones. It's the story of two disciples as they're walking on the road to Emmaus, and they're wondering about Jesus' story, and they're processing what his story has anything to do with the chaos of the time. So I'm going to read this text to you now. It's in the Gospel of Luke, the 35th chapter, and I'll read it for you now. On that same day, which is the day of the resurrection, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked alongside them, but they were kept from recognizing him. So Jesus asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" Well, they stood still, and their faces were still downcast. But one of them, Cleopas, asked Jesus, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked them. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. But then the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. And we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They had gone to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But they didn't see Jesus." So Jesus said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" And then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in the scriptures concerning himself. Then, as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly. "Stay with us," they said, "for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over." So Jesus went and stayed with them. So while they were at the table, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Their eyes were suddenly opened and they recognized him. And he disappeared from their sight. And they asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It's true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized in the breaking of the bread. This is the gospel of the Lord. So, I'm going to invite you over the next week, after listening to this reflection, to think about your story. Think about where you are in life. What has brought you to this place? What are your hopes, your joys, your doubts? Maybe where have you seen Jesus along your way? Or hoped to see him, but you didn't believe he was there? Do you have unanswered questions or doubts about how your story and Jesus's relates? Do you have unresolved hurts? But also, do you have joys and hopes? And what does Jesus' story have to do with your joys and hopes? I invite you to think this week about that, and we're going to be sharing those stories in the weeks to come. And we're going to be talking about how they impact our faith and how our faith impacts our story. And we're going to go a little bit beyond that too. We're going to be asking, what is the world's story? What is happening right now that is bringing us to a liminal point at the beginning of Lent where we've come through the darkest of times, but we can begin to see a glimmer of hope? We bring to that story, the world's story, unanswered questions, doubts, but also hopes and joys. And then, what is Jesus' story? What about your faith? Is that something that you weave into your own story, or is it something that's separate, apart? How would your story and the story of Jesus connect? So I invite you to think about those things so that when we join again and we begin to tell our own stories, I'll share with you mine, and I'll find a way for us to share those stories with one another. We can begin to unpack those things. We can begin to walk together on the road to Emmaus. And we can be joined by Jesus, who will enliven our hearts and our hopes. Thanks be to God.